Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are dissecting a figure who creates this very specific kind of gravity in the intellectual world.
He certainly does.
Depending on who you ask, he's either, the high priest of rationality who saves biology from fuzzy thinking, or he is the arrogant face of a cold, godless worldview.
Yeah, and there is almost never a middle ground when it comes to Richard Dawkins.
Not at all.
It's a polarization that he seems to not only accept, but I think actively cultivate at times.
It's rare to find someone who's had two completely distinct peaks in their career, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, you have the Richard Dawkins of the 1970s, the brilliant Oxford biologist who completely revolutionized how we understand evolution with the selfish gene.
And that alone would have secured his legacy, right? Case closed.
Oh, absolutely. Hall of Fame scientist. But
Yeah, right.
Then you have the second act.
Darwin's Rottweiler.
That's the one. The leader of the new atheist movement, the man who wrote The God Delusion, and basically decided to take a sledgehammer to organize religion.
And the timing for this retrospective, it feels crucial. He was born in 1941. He's in his 80s now.
Right.
And he recently announced his final speaking tour for late 2024. It really feels like the closing chapter of a very long, very loud argument he's been having with the world.
It creates a perfect opportunity to step back and look at the long reach of his own life, to borrow a phrase from his work.
I like that.
We want to understand how the boy collecting insects in colonial Africa became the man deconstructing the Bible on television. And, maybe most surprisingly, how a rigorous biologist accidentally invented the concept of the meme.
Providing the vocabulary for the entire internet age, decades before it even existed, is wild.
That's incredible.
We have a massive stack of source material to get through. His memoirs, his seminal scientific books like The Selfish Gene and the Extended Phenotype, his polemics against religion, and the whole dossier of controversies that have dogged him in recent years.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But I want to start with the biology, because I think people often skip straight to the atheism.
They do.
And they miss the fact that his view on God is actually just a downstream consequence of his view on genes.
That is exactly the right way to frame it. You cannot understand the atheist without first understanding the ethologist. His entire worldview is bottom-up. It all starts with the replicating molecule.
So let's talk about that origin story. We usually picture Dawkins in, the dusty halls and ivory towers of Oxford, but he didn't start there.
No, not at all. He started in Nairobi, Kenya, in the waning days of the British Empire.
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
He dropped the Clinton later.
Yeah, wisely, I think.
Huh.
He was born in 1941 into what you would call the colonial administrative class. His father was an agricultural civil servant in Nyasaland, which is now Malawi.
So it's a very specific kind of background.
It is. It's a background of landed gentry.
Mm-hmm.
His family owned an estate back in Oxfordshire called Over Norton Park. So it's a world of privilege, certainly, but also a world of, I think, isolation and intense observation.
And being a child in that environment, just surrounded by the raw nature of East Africa, that usually leads to one or two things, right? Either a deep spiritual connection to the land or a fierce, almost forensic curiosity about how it all works. And Dawkins clearly took the latter path.
He did, but it wasn't an immediate rejection of the spiritual. And I think this is a common misconception about him. He wasn't born a skeptic.
Right. He had a pretty standard Anglican upbringing.
He did. He was confirmed in the Church of England. In fact, he said that throughout his early teenage years, he was quite devout.
So what broke the spell? I've read that he talks about the argument from design.
This is critical to understanding his whole intellectual journey. The young Dawkins looked at the natural world, the insane complexity of a dragonfly's wing, the structure of a human eye, and his intuition told him what most people's intuition tells them.
This is a machine.
Yeah.
And machines have designers.
Exactly. Therefore, there must be a God. It's the classic William Paley's watchmaker argument. If you're walking on a heath and you find a watch, you don't assume the wind and rain just assembled it.
You assume a watchmaker.
You assume a watchmaker. It's a very seductive argument because it aligns perfectly with our human experience of creating things.
Oh, of course.
But then, around the age of 16, he really truly grasped the mechanism of Darwinian natural selection.
The actual process.
The process. He realized that you could get the watch without the watchmaker. If you have enough time and enough variation and a consistent selection pressure, simple things become complex things all by themselves, automatically.
And he described this realization as what? Pulling the rug out?
Pulling the rug out from under his faith, that's his phrase. Once the designer hypothesis was rendered superfluous by a better, more elegant explanation, he just discarded it.
It wasn't an emotional rebellion.
No, not at all. It was an efficiency decision. The God hypothesis was no longer necessary to explain the data.
That sounds incredibly consistent with the man he would become. Just a cold, logical assessment.
Precisely. And that rigorous focus on mechanism followed him to Oxford. He went to Balliol College and fell under the mentorship of Nicholas Tinbergen.
Now, Tinbergen is a name people should know.
An absolute giant in the history of biology, a Nobel Prize winner and one of the founders of modern ethology.
Ethology being the study of animal behavior, but
Right.
it's distinct from the Skinner box psychology that was big at the time. Right?
Yes, very different. While American behaviorists were, putting rats in mazes to study learning in a very artificial setting, the ethologists like Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz were out in the field.
In the mud.
In the mud, asking why animals have these instincts. Why does a gull chick peck at a red spot on its mother's beak to get food? Tinbergen taught Dawkins to look at behavior not as some mystical spirit of the animal, but as a biological adaptation.
Something shaped by evolution.
Just like a limb or an organ, it's a piece of survival technology.
And so Dawkins' PhD was on, what was it? Selective pecking and the domestic chick.
It sounds almost comical, doesn't it, watching baby chickens peck at spots all day?
A little bit.
But it was actually a study in decision-making models. He was looking for the rules, the algorithms governing the behavior. If I change the color of the spot or the shape, how does the pecking behavior change?
He was trying to reverse engineer the chick's brain.
In a way, yes. He was attempting to view the animal as a processing system, running a program.
This brings us to 1976 and the book that, well, it changed everything. The Selfish Gene.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the most famously misunderstood titles in the history of popular science.
Oh, without a doubt. He has spent 50 years correcting the record on that.
I still hear people say, oh, Dawkins says we have a gene for selfishness, so it's okay if I'm a jerk.
That is the bane of his existence.
Mm-hmm.
The selfishness refers to the gene, the replicator, not the organism. In fact, the entire point of the book is to explain how incredibly altruistic behavior in animals can evolve because of selfish genes.
So let's break down the paradigm shift here. Before Dawkins, and he was synthesizing the work of researchers like George C. Williams and W.D. Hamilton, the prevailing view was group selection.
Or species selection, right? The idea that animals do things for the good of the species.
You'd watch a nature documentary and the narrator would say in a very grand voice, the lemming bravely commits suicide to leave more food for the rest of the herd.
It sounds nice. It fits our human morality. It feels right. But Dawkins, channeling Williams, pointed out the fatal flaw in that logic.
It's mathematically unstable.
Completely. Imagine a population of lemmings where most are altruistic and will happily jump off a cliff for the common good. Now introduce one mutant, a selfish individual who thinks, you know what, I'm going to sit this one out.
That selfish individual survives every time.
Not only survives, but reproduces. And crucially, passes on the selfish gene for not jumping off the cliff.
And very quickly, the altruists are all dead.
And the population is entirely made up of the descendants of the selfish one. The good of the species strategy, as loving as it sounds, gets invaded and destroyed by selfishness from within. It just doesn't work.
So Dawkins zooms the lens in. He says, forget the species, forget the group, forget even the individual organism. Look at the gene.
This is the gene's eye view. It's his central idea. He argues that the fundamental unit of life, the thing that natural selection is actually acting on, is the replicator.
The gene.
The gene. It wants, and of course wants is a metaphor, to make copies of itself. The body, the individual organism, you, me, a lion, an oak tree. We are just survival machines.
Survival machine. It's such a cold industrial metaphor.
It is. A robot built by the genes to carry them around, protect them from the elements, and negotiate the environment so they can get themselves into the next generation. We are their vehicles.
It reduces a human being to a temporary vessel.
Which is existential horror for some people, but for Dawkins it was profoundly clarifying. It explains things that individual selection can't.
Like the paradox of altruism.
Exactly. Why does a honeybee sting an intruder and die to save the hive? It's suicide. Why does a bird give a warning call that attracts the hawk to itself but saves the rest of the flock?
If the bird is just trying to survive and reproduce, that's a catastrophically stupid move.
From the bird's perspective, yes. But if the genes are trying to survive, it's a calculated bet. And this is where we have to bring in the work of W.D. Hamilton and the concept of inclusive fitness.
The math of kinship.
That's it. It's just simple math. You share, on average, 50% of your genes with a full sibling or a child. You share 25% with a niece or nephew, 12.5% with a first cousin, and so on.
Right.
So Hamilton formulated a rule. It's literally called Hamilton's rule, that predicts when an altruistic act will be favored by natural selection. It will happen if the cost to me is less than the benefit to my relative, multiplied by how related we are.
So the famous J.B.S. Haldane joke, I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins.
Precisely. From the gene's perspective, saving 2 brothers, who each carry a 50% copy of you, is statistically equivalent to saving yourself. Your death is a good trade if it saves 2 of them.
The gene doesn't care which body it's in.
It doesn't care at all, as long as a copy of it survives to the next generation. So the selfish gene builds an organism, a survival machine, that acts altruistically toward its kin, because that's a brilliant strategy for the gene to replicate itself.
But this feels like it strips the nobility out of something like a mother's love for her child.
Yeah.
It turns it into a cold genetic calculation.
And Dawkins would argue he isn't stripping the nobility, he's explaining its origin. The feeling of love, that powerful, overwhelming emotion, is the mechanism the gene uses to ensure the protective behavior happens.
It's the psychological software.
It's the software. We feel love because our ancestors who didn't feel a powerful bond with their offspring didn't protect them as well, and their genes died out. We are the descendants of the ones who were good at loving, because love is an efficient survival strategy for genes.
Now, critics, and there were many, people like the great Stephen Jay Gould or Ernst Mayr, they had a big problem with
A
this.
huge problem.
They argued that you can't just select a single gene. You can't have a gene for long legs if you don't also have genes for strong bones and a powerful heart and better circulation. The body is an integrated whole, not a collection of parts.
That was the unity of the genotype argument. They claimed Dawkins was being far too reductionist, treating the genome like a beanbag of isolated traits that you could just pick and choose from.
Which seems like a fair criticism on the surface.
It does, but Dawkins's counterargument is subtle and, I think, very powerful. He completely agrees that genes interact in complex ways. But he argues that from the perspective of any single gene, all the other genes in the genome are just part of the environment it has to deal with.
Okay, unpack that.
A gene for, say, sharp teeth is being selected for its ability to work well in a body that also has the gene for strong jaw muscles. If it finds itself in a body with weak jaw muscles, it's not very useful and it fails.
So genes are selected for their ability to cooperate with other genes.
Exactly. So over eons of evolutionary time, you get these cooperative clusters of genes that work well together. They form a team. But the fundamental unit of selection, the thing that is actually being passed on or not, remains the single replicator, the gene.
Okay, so if the selfish gene was about looking inward at the code, his next major work, The Extended Phenotype in 1982, was about looking outward. And I know for a fact that Dawkins considers this his single most important scientific contribution, more than the memes, more than the atheism.
He does. He's very clear on that. The extended phenotype is the logical, and some would say radical, conclusion of the gene's eye view.
So Standard Biology 101 teaches us genotype is the DNA code, the blueprint.
Right.
And the phenotype is the physical expression of that code, the body. Blue eyes, black hair, height. The phenotype stops at the skin.
And Dawkins just asked a very simple question. Why? Why should it stop at the skin?
What do you mean?
If a gene's purpose is to manipulate the world to ensure its own replication, and it builds a body to do that, why can't it also manipulate the inanimate world outside that body?
Give me an example.
The classic example is the beaver dam.
Okay, the beaver dam. It's a structure made of wood, rocks, and mud. It's part of the environment.
But why does it exist? It exists because specific genes in the beaver's brain wire it to have an urge to chew trees and pile them up in a particular way in running water.
Right.
The dam then creates a deep pond, which protects the beaver from predators and allows it to store food for the winter. The dam directly increases the survival chances of the beaver's genes.
So you're saying the dam is a genetic trait.
Dawkins argues that the dam is a phenotypic effect of the beaver's genes just as much as the beaver's teeth or its flat tail is. The gene's influence reaches out of the body and reshapes the landscape.
The phenotype is extended.
It is extended, and it gets even stranger and more undeniable when you look at parasites.
No.
This is where the concept really becomes mind-bending. There is a fluke, a type of parasitic flatworm that infects snails. But to complete its life cycle, it needs to get inside a bird.
So it needs the bird to eat the snail, a classic problem for a parasite.
A classic problem, but birds don't usually eat these particular snails because they hide in the shade, they're camouflaged. So the parasite manipulates the snail. It hijacks its brain.
Ow.
It migrates into the snail's eye stalks and causes them to swell up, turn these bright pulsating colors, red, green, yellow, and it makes the snail climb to the top of a plant leaf in broad daylight and wiggle.
Oh my God. It turns the snail into a flashing neon sign that says, "Eat me."
It perfectly mimics a caterpillar, which birds love to eat. The bird swoops down, eats the pulsating eye stalk, the parasite gets into the bird, and the life cycle is complete.
That's horrifying.
It is, but now ask yourself, whose phenotype is that pulsating, colorful eye stalk? It's happening to the snail's body, but it is being caused by the parasite's genes.
The parasite's genes are driving the snail's body like a stolen car.
Exactly. Dawkins argues that this is definitive proof that the reach of a gene is not limited by the cell membrane or the skin. It extends as far as its causal power can reach into the world.
It completely blurs the line between self and world in a way that it's almost psychedelic when you think about it.
It destroys the neat and tidy idea of the individual organism as a sealed, sovereign unit. We are all the time, dealing with the extended phenotypic effects of other creatures' genes.
And speaking of things that spread from one being to another and manipulate behavior, we have to discuss the meme.
The meme.
It's so ironic that Dawkins coined this term in a chapter of The Selfish Gene back in 1976, long before the internet, and now it's arguably the primary way that an entire generation understands and communicates culture.
It was almost an afterthought in the book, which is the funny part. He just needed a final chapter to demonstrate that Darwinism is a universal asset, as Daniel Dennett would later call it.
Meaning it applies to any system where you have replication, variation, and selection.
Right, it doesn't have to be DNA, it could be anything. So he needed a cultural equivalent to the gene.
A unit of imitation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He looked for a word that sounded a bit like gene and was rooted in the Greek word for imitation, which is mimam. He shortened it to meme.
But his definition wasn't, a picture of a cat with a funny caption.
No. For Dawkins, a meme was a unit of cultural transmission. A catchy tune, a recipe for a cake, a fashion trend, the technology for building a stone arch, or a philosophical idea like the concept of God. These are all memes.
And they follow the same Darwinian rules as genes.
Broadly, yes. He outlined 3 key conditions for a successful replicator. Fidelity, which is how accurately it is copied. Fecundity, how many copies are made. And longevity, how long the copies last.
Let's take a catchy pop song.
A catchy pop song has incredibly high fecundity. You hear it on the radio, you start humming it, your friend hears you, they start humming it. It spreads like a virus through the population of minds.
Whereas a complex mathematical proof.
Very low fecundity. Very few people have the background knowledge to understand it, let alone remember it accurately enough to pass it on.
And what about fidelity? This is where memes seem really different from genes.
They are. Genes have incredibly high copying fidelity thanks to the chemistry of DNA. Mutations are relatively rare. Memes mutate constantly.
It's like the game Telephone.
Exactly like that game. You tell a story, I retell it, but I exaggerate the funny part. The next person forgets the boring middle part and adds a new ending. The story evolves, sometimes very rapidly, as it spreads.
This leads to the darker side of the idea, the concept of the mind virus. Dawkins suggests that some memes survive not because they are true or useful to the host,
but simply because they are good at surviving and spreading.
And this is his primary critique of religion from a mimetic standpoint.
It is. He argues that many core religious beliefs are incredibly effective survival strategies for the meme itself. Think of a belief like, if you do not believe this, you will suffer eternal torment in hell.
That's a powerful incentive not to abandon the belief.
It's a terrifyingly effective mechanism, or a commandment like, you must go forth and convert others to save their souls.
That turns the host into an active transmission vector for the meme.
Precisely. From this perspective, it doesn't matter one bit whether the belief is factually true or not. All that matters is that the belief has a built-in psychological mechanism to ensure its own replication and transmission.
So if we are survival machines for our genes, our brains are also survival machines for memes.
And sometimes those two imperatives come into direct conflict. A celibate monk, for example, is a total dead end for his genes. 0 genetic reproduction.
A failure is a survival machine.
A complete failure. But he might be a fantastic replicator for the Catholicism meme, dedicating his entire life to studying and spreading the idea. In that case, you could say the meme has hijacked the genetic vehicle for its own purposes.
This kind of thinking, this relentless application of Darwinian logic to everything, it caused a lot of friction within the scientific community itself.
It really did.
The so-called Darwin Wars of the 80s and 90s were intense. And it was essentially Dawkins versus Stephen Jay Gould.
It was a clash of titans. It really was.
Yeah.
You had Gould, the charismatic Harvard paleontologist, versus Dawkins, the precise Oxford ethologist.
And they agreed on the big picture stuff. Evolution is true, creationism is junk science.
Oh, yeah, on that they were united. But they disagreed profoundly on the mechanism, the tempo, and the emphasis of evolution.
Gould was the champion of punctuated equilibrium.
Right. Gould looked at the fossil record, and he didn't see smooth, gradual change. He saw long periods of stasis, millions of years, where a clam just looks like a clam interrupted by, geologically speaking, sudden, rapid bursts of speciation.
So evolution happens in fits and starts.
That was his argument, that it isn't a smooth, gradual slope. It's more like long, flat landings with steep staircases in between.
And Dawkins.
Dawkins is a strict gradualist. He's a Darwinian fundamentalist in that sense. He argues that even those sudden bursts that Gould saw in the fossil record, which might be 50,000 years long, that's plenty of time for slow, steady, gene-by-gene selection to do its work.
He thought Gould was just over-dramatizing the gaps in the record.
Pretty much. He saw it as a storm in a teacup, but there was also the deeper fight about adaptationism.
Right. Gould accused Dawkins and his allies of being ultra-Darwinians who thought that everything in an animal is a perfect adaptation, designed for a specific purpose.
The famous paper was The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm.
A mouthful.
It is. But the idea is simple. A spandrel is the triangular space you get between two arches in a cathedral. It wasn't designed on purpose. It's just a byproduct of putting a round dome on top of square arches.
But then artists came along and painted beautiful mosaics in them.
Exactly. So Gould argued that many biological traits are like spandrels. They're just architectural byproducts of other things. Take the human chin. Is the chin an adaptation for something, or is it just the shape that's left over when the human jaw shrank during our evolution?
So Gould's point was, don't tell these neat, just-so stories about every single feature. Sometimes things are just there.
Right. And Dawkins pushed back hard. He argued that while, sure, byproducts exist, natural selection is the only force we know of that is powerful enough to explain complex functional design.
Like the eye.
Like the eye or the wing or the echolocation of a bat. That kind of exquisite engineering, he argues, cannot be a random byproduct. It screams adaptation.
This scientific rigorousness, this fierce defense of natural selection is the ultimate explanation for life's complexity. It seems this is what eventually led Dawkins out of the lab and into the public square.
I think that's exactly right. And the key moment was the Simon E. Professorship for the Public Understanding of Science.
A chair at Oxford he held from 1995 to 2008.
And his official mandate was to communicate science to the public. But he increasingly came to feel that the single biggest barrier to the public understanding of science, specifically evolution, was religious faith.
He felt you couldn't properly teach biology if people's minds were, in his view, inoculated against it by childhood indoctrination.
Exactly. And he grew incredibly tired of the polite, hands-off truth that existed between science and religion.
The NOMA idea from his rival, Stephen Jay Gould.
Precisely. NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. The idea that science covers the empirical universe, what are stars made of, how does life evolve, and religion covers the domain of ultimate meaning, morality, and value. And the two should never meet or interfere.
And Dawkins absolutely hated that idea.
He despised it. He called it cowardly and dishonest. He argued that religions don't just talk about morality, they make specific factual claims about the universe.
Like,
if you say Jesus rose from the dead, that is a biological claim about a human body reanimating. If you say God answers prayers, that is a claim about causal interference in the laws of physics.
so he saw them as scientific hypotheses.
Yes. And as such, they should be tested, analyzed, and if they lack any evidence whatsoever, they should be rejected, not cordoned off in some special protected category.
This all culminated, of course, in The God Delusion in 2006. And that wasn't just another book, it was a cultural event.
It was a phenomenon. It sold millions and millions of copies. It really tapped into a post-9/11 anxiety about religious fundamentalism.
And it marked the real rise of new atheism.
Absolutely. Alongside Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett, who were famously dubbed the Four Horsemen Dawkins, helped shift the conversation. It moved from a passive, I don't happen to believe in God, to an active, aggressive stance of religion is not just wrong, it is actively harmful.
He has a scale, doesn't he? The spectrum of theistic probability.
He does. He didn't want to fall into the same trap of dogmatism he accused the religious of, claiming absolute certainty. So he created a scale from 1 to 7.
Where 1 is strong theist, 100% sure God exists.
And 7 is strong atheist, 100% sure God does not exist.
And Dawkins places himself where?
He places himself at a 6.9, a de facto atheist.
Why not a full 7?
Because, as a scientist, you can't technically prove a negative. You can't prove there aren't fairies at the bottom of the garden. But, as he likes to say, we don't live our lives being agnostic about fairies. We live our lives as if they don't exist.
So he treats the God hypothesis with the same level of everyday skepticism.
Precisely. The odds are so vanishingly small that it's not worth considering.
One of the central arguments in the God delusion is his rebuttal to the design argument, which he calls the ultimate Boeing 747 gambit.
Right, this is him flipping the watchmaker argument back on itself. The creationist says the complexity of the eye implies a designer.
And Dawkins asks,
so who designed the designer? If your designer is complex enough to design an entire universe and a human eye, that designer must be infinitely more complex and statistically improbable than the thing it's supposed to explain.
You haven't solved the problem of complexity. You've just pushed it back one step and made it bigger.
You've made it infinitely bigger. He argues that natural selection is the only theory we have that actually explains how you get complexity out of simplicity, how you can bootstrap design from the ground up without needing a pre-existing designer.
Yet, despite this incredibly hardline, uncompromising stance, there's a nuance that always confuses people. He calls himself a cultural Christian.
And he's reiterated this very recently. It drives some of his followers crazy.
It seems like a massive contradiction.
To him, it isn't. He loves the King James Bible as a masterpiece of English literature. He adores the music of Bach, like the St. Matthew Passion. He appreciates the beauty of a village church and the rhythm of the church calendar.
So he separates the culture from the creed.
Exactly. He separates the meme of the culture, the art, and the tradition from the truth claim of the theology. He wants to keep the cathedral but evict the deity. He argues you can and should appreciate the rich cultural heritage without buying into the supernatural beliefs.
But this cultural Christian identity has also fueled some of his more recent and more pointed controversies.
It has.
He seems to fear the decline of Christianity in Europe, not because he thinks it's true, but because he's deeply worried about what might replace it.
And this brings us to the messy, often Twitter-fueled chapter of his later years. Dawkins has expressed, quite bluntly, his concern that if the gentle, largely ignored Anglicanism of Britain collapses, it won't be replaced by his brand of secular humanism.
But by a more assertive form of Islam?
Yes. And he views what he calls fundamentalist Islamism as a far greater and more immediate threat to the liberal values he holds dear, things like women's rights, gay rights, and especially freedom of speech.
And this is where the old liberal of the 1970s clashes head-on with the modern left of the 2020s.
It's a huge clash. Dawkins sees himself as a classic Enlightenment liberal. He cares about free inquiry, individual rights, and objective truth. But his critiques of Islam have drawn extremely heavy fire.
There was the infamous tweet.
The one where he contrasted the number of Nobel Prizes won by Trinity College, Cambridge, which is a lot, versus the number won by the entire Muslim world, which is very few.
Which is factually a true statement, but
interpretively incendiary. Critics argued it was scientism at its absolute worst, completely ignoring centuries of colonialism, geopolitical strife, economic and funding disparities that help explain why modern science flourished in the West and stagnated in many other parts of the world.
it came across as a cheap shot at a marginalized group, rather than a sophisticated critique of theology.
That's certainly how it was received, and he was disinvited from a conference for sharing a satirical video mocking certain aspects of feminism and Islamism.
Right. But let's talk about the specific controversy that actually cost him an award, the one that got his 1996 Humanist of the Year award revoked in 2021, the transgender debate.
This is the real flashpoint. This is where his deep-seated biological realism collided with modern gender theory.
It started with a tweet.
It did. He tweeted a comparison involving Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who identified as black and was head of an NAACP chapter.
I remember that story.
And Dawkins just asked his followers to discuss. He essentially asked, if we condemn Dolezal for claiming a racial identity that conflicts with her ancestry, why do we celebrate trans individuals for claiming a gender identity that conflicts with their biology?
And to his critics, that question was itself an act of violence.
It was seen as denying the validity of trans people's very existence. To the American Humanist Association, it was the final straw. They revoked his award, stating that he was using the guise of scientific discourse to demean and harm vulnerable groups.
But he didn't back down.
No, he doubled down. He wrote an op-ed recently laying out his position very clearly. He argues that sex is a biological binary, determined at conception by the size of the gamete sperm or egg, and that it is observed at birth, not assigned.
A very biological, gene's-eye view perspective.
Entirely. He argues that the phrase trans woman is a woman is a linguistic distortion, a polite fiction. He says he is happy to use preferred pronouns as a matter of simple human courtesy, but he refuses, as a scientist, to accept that a trans woman is biologically female.
So it's the gene's-eye view crashing into the identity's-eye view. He looks at the chromosomes and says, that's the objective reality. Society, or a part of it, is saying, no, reality is also social and psychological and lived.
That is the conflict in a nutshell. He believes there is an objective material reality that cannot be wished away by language or identity politics. He sees himself as the little boy in the story, pointing out that the emperor has no clothes.
Well, his critics see an old, out-of-touch man yelling at people to stop being who they are.
Exactly.
There was another controversy we can't ignore because it comes up constantly when his name is mentioned. The mild pedophilia comments.
Yes, this is a prime example of Dawkins applying a kind of cold scientific taxonomy where people desperately want moral outrage.
He was discussing his own experience at boarding school.
Correct, where a master had touched him inappropriately. And in an interview, he described it as mild pedophilia and made a point of contrasting it with violent penetrative abuse.
He was trying to create a scale of badness, a hierarchy of harm.
Yes, just like his spectrum of theistic probability. He was arguing that we shouldn't lump unwanted touching over clothes into the exact same moral and legal category as violent rape. Logically, he is correct. They are different actions with different levels of trauma and impact.
But emotionally, and in the court of public opinion?
It sounded like he was minimizing or making excuses for child abuse. The backlash was immediate and immense. He eventually apologized for the distress he caused, but you could tell he was genuinely baffled that people couldn't separate the intellectual classification of an act from the moral condemnation of the act.
Which highlights what might be his biggest flaw as a public intellectual.
I think so.
He often lacks the emotional intelligence to read the room. He treats human suffering like a data point to be categorized, not an experience to be empathized with.
Which is the shadow side of his very brilliance. The same intellectual detachment that allowed him to see humanity as just survival machines for genes prevents him from understanding why we don't feel like survival machines, and why telling us we are feels so dehumanizing to many.
And yet, for all the controversies, his politics are surprisingly progressive in other areas.
Very much so. He was a vocal opponent of the Iraq War from the very beginning. He is passionately anti-Brexit, and he's a champion of the Great Ape Project.
This goes right back to his core understanding of evolutionary continuity.
It does. If we are all just cousins on the same family tree, then the line we draw between human and chimpanzee is arbitrary. It's just a matter of time and branching.
So he argues they should have rights.
Yes, that great apes, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans should have basic legal rights. The right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to protection from torture. He calls our current treatment of them speciesism, a form of bigotry just like racism or sexism.
It's a radical expansion of the moral circle, and it's driven entirely by his deep understanding of biology.
It is.
Let's pivot for a moment to the man behind the public firestorms. His personal life has its own interesting textures. He's been married 4 times.
And there's a delightful pop culture intersection here that I love. His third wife was the actress Lala Ward.
Romana from Doctor Who.
The Time Lord.
The very same.
Yeah.
A beloved companion to Tom Baker's Doctor, and they were introduced by the author Douglas Adams.
Of course they were. The author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That makes perfect sense.
It's the ultimate nerdy Venn diagram. Adams was a huge science enthusiast and a committed atheist himself.
I've heard he credited Dawkins with giving him the intellectual framework for his own atheism.
He did. They were part of this golden circle of British rationalist intellectuals. There's a very touching eulogy that Dawkins wrote for Adams after he died, where he talks about how the universe is a poorer, less interesting place without him to explain it.
And Dawkins has appeared in pop culture himself, hasn't he? He had a cameo in Doctor Who, and he was in The Simpsons.
He was. In The Simpsons, he voiced a demon version of himself in Ned Flanders' religious nightmare, tempting him with a copy of The God Delusion.
He clearly has a sense of humor about his own public image.
He does. And the Nightwish album.
This is my favorite piece of Dawkins trivia. It's the best. The Finnish symphonic metal band Nightwish wrote an entire concept album called Endless Forms Most Beautiful, which is a direct quote from the last paragraph of Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
And they asked Dawkins to provide narration.
Yes. So you have these epic, soaring, heavy metal riffs and a powerful female vocalist, and then suddenly you hear Richard Dawkins's calm, plummy Oxford voice reading passages about the grandeur of life and the beauty of evolution. He even performed with them on stage at Wembley Arena.
It shows that for all the accusations of him having a cold and bleak philosophy, he finds a deep, almost spiritual romance in reality itself.
He calls it the magic of reality.
Yeah.
That was the title of one of his books. He sincerely believes that understanding how a rainbow works, understanding Newton's optics, doesn't unweave the rainbow and strip it of its beauty. It adds a new layer of beauty.
The beauty of understanding.
Precisely. He gets genuinely emotional when he talks about the sheer luck of our existence. He talks about the unborn ghosts.
Explain that.
He talks about the staggering odds against your specific birth. The trillions upon trillions of potential people who could have been born if a different sperm had fertilized the egg or if your parents had never met. But they are the unborn ghosts in the wings. We are the lucky few who made it onto the stage.
We won the genetic lottery.
We won. We are the ones who get to see the stars and ponder our existence. And he thinks that is a profound privilege we shouldn't waste on what he sees as superstition and falsehoods.
On that note, he had a health scare in 2016. A minor hemorrhagic stroke.
He did. He recovered quite well, but it was a stark reminder of the fragility of the survival machine. It's largely why he's doing this final speaking tour now. He's aware that the clock is ticking.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, how do we begin to summarize the legacy of a figure as complex and polarizing as Richard Dawkins?
I think he is both a bridge builder and a bridge burner.
How so?
He built a magnificent bridge between the complex mathematical world of modern genetics and the general public, giving millions of people the language and the concepts to understand who we are and where we come from. But at the same time, he took a flamethrower to the bridge between the scientific establishment and the religious world.
Forcing a conflict that many people, including many scientists, wish he hadn't.
A conflict they felt was unnecessary, but he felt was essential.
He also changed the dictionary itself. The selfish gene, the meme, the blind watchmaker. These are now part of the language.
You cannot have a serious conversation about modern biology or modern internet culture without using his words. That is a very rare and powerful legacy.
I want to leave our listener with a final thought, something that's been nagging at me as we've been talking through all this.
Go on.
So Dawkins taught us that we are survival machines built by our genes to help them replicate. Then he taught us that memes are the new replicators, and they use our brains as their survival machines to replicate.
Correct on both counts, according to his view.
So if we look at Dawkins' own career, the relentless touring, the endless stream of books, the constant tweeting, the picking of fights, the doubling down in controversies, is he the master of his ideas? Or has he himself become the ultimate survival machine for his own memes? Has the new atheism meme, the rationality meme, hijacked the vessel called Richard Dawkins to ensure its own replication, even at the cost of his personal reputation and scientific legacy?
That is the ultimate and perhaps terrifying question of the extended phenotype, isn't it? Do we have ideas or do ideas have us? And I suspect that Richard Dawkins, the rigorous biologist, would be the first to look at the evidence and admit the meme is in charge.
A chilling thought to end on. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll be back with another stack of sources next time.